And those tributaries, even to a greater extent than the river, are under the control of private landowners. So again, it just illustrates the primary importance of having people get on board, get involved, and really embrace this cleanup. So enter the Clark Fork Coalition. Bought the ranch essentially so that they could have a stake in this game. So they could figure out, how do we ground truth these ideas about cleaning up the river, and how do we do it in the context of a sustainable ranching operation? And they picked a good one for that, because it is a mess. What you're seeing here, and I'll just go real quick through this. Again, my house is right here, or right there. This is that field we were looking at before from a different angle. And what we've got here are two photographs. This is I think a 2009 satellite photo. That's a 1949 aerial photo. And what I want to show you is these right here, these little dots. Each one of these is a sampling pit. This was all completed this summer. If it's a red dot, they're basically going to scoop it up, haul it out, and put something new there. If it's a yellow dot, you're looking at some sort of a treatment in place, like a tilling with lime or something like that. What I want to illustrate here is twofold. First, this is a tremendous amount of contamination that we're dealing with. And it's contamination that affects areas where we do a lot of our winter grazing, areas that we utilize heavily, where we make hay, all that kind of stuff. The other thing I want to show you is that part of the challenge here has been that if you look at these old photos, you can see a lot more bare ground in the 49 photos than these. A lot of the folks that live there look at that and they say, well, look at that, the river's healed itself. No worries. It used to run red, now it's greenish. So, let's leave it alone. But the issue with that is the contaminants are all still there. You can see that, even though, for instance, right here, we've got really good grass cover right there. In fact, I can tell you that walking around there, it looks like better grass than over here because it's sub-irrigated. You look at that on the surface, you say that's fine. And it might be fine for now. But what we know about this river is it's a really low gradient channel and it migrates like crazy. You can see the old meanders here. You can see them all over this property. So if we don't remove this stuff, it's going downstream at some point. And that's a consequence we really want to avoid. So it's crucial for us to be able to show people, to be able to model this cleanup and say, here's how it works at every step. Here's why it's necessary for everybody up here. This is just a little closer look. That's what a slicken looks like, these dead zones. I wish I could have caught it during the right season because in the right season, those will turn turquoise. You get copper salts. The contaminants, I think I said, are arsenic, cadmium, copper, lead, and zinc. And you will get those copper and heavy metal salts percolating out of the ground. You leave a cow bone down there, it will turn turquoise. It's a really, really strange hellscape. But this and this are about 100 yards apart. So I just want to illustrate that. This is right out behind my house. This is a place where a lot of us need to make a living and make a life. This is a place that essentially needs to be picked up and moved somewhere. And where we move that is another big issue. So the challenge. How do we clean up this river while simultaneously demonstrating and modeling sustainable ranching practices? I would argue that a lot of the guys in our area don't have a sustainable ranching practice right now, either financially or ecologically. How do we do this? How do we work this balance out? That's the big challenge of this ranch. Sustainable, like I said, it has to be ecologically sustainable. That's first and foremost. If we don't have it ecologically sustainable, it's not going to work in the long term. It has to be economically sustainable. And I mean that on a year-to-year basis. We do not have the latitude that a lot of people have in that valley, for the most part, of having outside money subsidizing ranching operations. It also has to be socially sustainable, which means it has to be the kind of thing that local people can believe in, the kind of thing that they can get behind, and it has to be the kind of thing that their kids will want to return to. So essentially the challenge here is you clean it up, you make ranching pay a living wage, and you make ranching improve the land. And that's kind of a tall order sometimes. We want to make reproducible models. We need to have things that our neighbors can look at and can say, yeah, that would work on my side of the fence for whatever reason. Because it pays better, because it grows more grass. It has to be demonstrably good for a production ranch before we're willing to do it. So what I'm going to do here for a minute is I'm going to elaborate on some of the steps that we've taken toward that goal, concrete steps on the ranch. Then, like I said, I'm going to step back and tell you guys what I think that means for our valley and for the rest of the West as well. Infrastructure. On the property, we've torn out a lot of fence and we've built a lot of fence and we've modified a lot of fence. This right here is what I call a zero-cost improvement. We used some timber that we were cutting for slash, or that we were cutting to clear out an area anyway. We built a letdown section in one of the highest elk traffic areas on the ranch. I think it just cost me whatever staples cost to staple that wire to the trees. It did incredible things for elk passage through this pasture. It also minimized the amount of time I spend fixing that fence. We've also built a whole bunch of wildlife-friendly, high-tensile riparian fences, because this ranch historically didn't have a stock water system. Everything was grazing out of Dry Cottonwood Creek or the river. So we had to modify that. And now we have controlled access, and we have an entire variety of different sizes of riparian pastures, everything from like 100-acre riparian pastures to little slivers. So we can actually model how those different pastures work for us in terms of restoration and in terms of our ranching operation. Watering and stock distribution. I said we started out without a system. We got one now. We've got a gravity-fed stock watering system that pulls off of a little creek, waters all of our upland pastures, and then this down here we just finished 3 weeks ago. We developed a spring using an old mining truck tire, and that's a really cool thing to be able to take. What we're doing is we're actually taking the water from a spring, putting it through the tank, and then running it right out the other side of the tank back into the spring. So we only ever dried up about 20 yards of the thing, and we've got this whole new resource in an area of probably a square mile that didn't really have a watering source in it. So we've been able to do a few things that way. Before we started there, it was pretty much kind of a season-long deal, both on the river and in some of these upland pastures. We've been doing a lot of splitting them with temporary fence and trying to rotate through our pastures a little bit better. And you guys have heard plenty about that. I don't think I really need to rehash it, but this is a really cool tool. This isn't mine. I've got one very much like this, except without these goofy pigtail posts because they're kind of a pain. But this is a wire buggy. This allows us to spool out temporary electric fence just a little bit under 1 mile an hour, and have that up and going in good country, and pick it up at better than 1 mile per hour, almost 2 miles per hour we can get if a guy's willing to jog behind the thing picking it up. But that's an incredible tool, because we can spend a morning and we can split a section pasture, and that can really create some possibilities. I will say in as arid and as brittle of an environment as we are, and with as much topographical gradient as we have, you have to be really careful with your locations for these fences, because if you start crossing a whole bunch of washes, you can get those trails worn in, and we have really sandy, rocky almost soil, and it will just wash like that. So some caveats, but a really cool tool. This is made by J&J Manufacturing. He's a rancher in the Blackfoot, and he's started making these things, and I would encourage, if any of you guys are looking at using a lot of temporary fence, I would encourage checking them out. Monitoring. We've got a comprehensive monitoring system on the place, as you might expect from a scientific-based conservation group. We've got so much monitoring that sometimes I can't even stand it. We monitor our creeks, we monitor every pasture, we do pasture use, we do photo points, all kinds of stuff, but that's important. It's really important, because without that, we cannot measurably track what we're doing on the land, and we can't show our neighbors, here's our increased production. Here's where we've revegetated this area. So this is kind of like doing your homework. You may not want to do it, but for us, it's absolutely necessary to our mission, what we're trying to do out there. Let's see. The other thing, we've been using a lot more herding on the place, especially on our allotment, and I guess I'll get into that in a minute. I kind of forgot to take the sheep off his head. I was doing that. I didn't mean for that to actually be up here. But this guy does have weeds on the brain and weed control on the brain. This is a retired biologist named Jed Dewey, and he does we have an integrated weed management system. So we bring on about 700 ewes with lambs every year for a couple weeks. We graze spurge, which is, as you can see, a huge problem in some of our pastures, and they do a great job of controlling that. We also use biocontrols, bugs, spot spraying where we need it. We've been pretty aggressive with how we're treating these weeds. But some issues do come up when you start doing this aggressively. For instance, this hill right here, we have to treat this pretty hard with our sheep to make a dent in the spurge. And what we find is this is such it's kind of a barren thing. You know, oftentimes if we don't get those sheep in there right at the right season, if we're not really good with our timing, and it's hard to be good because we share that band of sheep with the entire rest of that side of the valley. We're in a cooperative grazing situation where we can pay for him to make the trip over there. He's all the way out of Lavina, which is a different part of the state. If we're not in there at the right time, we lose grass, and we don't want to lose a blade of grass off this particular hilltop. But we have seen some real improvements with the weeds. We had one pasture that used to be called the spurge pasture, and it looks better than some of the other pastures now. We might have to rename it, which I think is a good thing. I talked about herding. I want to talk about coexistence with wildlife, primarily predator species. We have been very fortunate on this place so far in that we haven't had a tremendous amount of depredation on our herds. However, we sit between the counties in Montana with the two highest numbers of wolf depredations on livestock, and we have an allotment that runs all the way to the Continental Divide. And the wolves have killed. So what we did is we wanted to be proactive about this instead of reactionary, and I think that's absolutely essential when we start to look at this. You know, if you take a reactionary point of view to something like this, then you start out angry. You start out with a cow getting killed and there's blood everywhere and guts and the whole 9 yards, and you're mad. You're just mad. You know, I've seen that firsthand. If, however, you come up with a plan like we did, and our plan was to work with a group called Keystone Conservation, hire a range rider, and really get on top of this thing by having increased human presence and a better system for knowing when we had problems up there. If you do that, it's worth it, if for no other reason than that you have a plan and you know what you're going to do when it happens. So this year what happened is we had a bunch of sheep from this sheep band that were killed by wolves. And we kind of put our plan into action. We had a bunch more people riding the hills, looking for trouble, looking for kill sites. And as far as we know, we made it out of there without losing anything that year. That said, it's not a perfect system. We lost those sheep. Last year we lost 28 sheep in a night to a mountain lion, which is a weird thing. I've never heard of it before, but you could see the tracks going in the whole 9 yards. Anyway, I really believe that we have the potential to do better with respect to this. And a lot of it comes from the way we approach it. We have a grass-fed beef program. It's a little thing right now. Of our herd, we're only taking about 10% and going grass-fed with it. Part of that's because it's hard to find a market for it as remote as we are and with as saturated as Montana is with beef. But we hope to scale it up, figure out other ways to do that. And one of the really cool things about doing a grass-fed beef program for us has been that we're actually able to tie two communities together that have been historically antagonistic, which is to say Missoula and the Deer Lodge Valley, because they've been fighting forever about like who's going to take the contaminants, whose fault are the contaminants, in the Clark Fork River, which runs through both places. But we can unite them in some small things like this and have Missoula thinking, well, Deer Lodge is where we get our food, and we know who we get it from. That's a tremendously positive thing when those two communities sit down to hash out major issues.